Looks like we're at 3 o'clock. Can you hear me?
Absolutely.
Okay. So it's we're waiting for Brad.
No, Brad's not here. I'll text Brad.
Did you have any luck, Linda?
I just texted. I'm gonna give him a call. I'm gonna go on mute.
Okay.
Hey, Linda.
I hear you, Brad. There you are. Need a picture. Are you there, Brad?
I'm here. Sorry, I had the wrong code.
Oh.
So I think we're all here.
Yeah, we're just waiting for Brad to show up with a face. We have his voice.
Oh, there.
There you go.
Okay.
Sorry, God. It's
All
a
right.
brand new experience every time.
Yeah. So I would like to call to order the work session for the Manzanita City Council on this day, March 8th, 2023 at 3 o'clock. As this is a work session, no decisions will be made. The agenda today will cover revenue diversification, indirect cost methodology, a discussion, and the budget committee, a discussion. Do we have approval for the agenda? Anyone out there?
Yep.
Okay. Is it seconded?
Yep.
I need a different second. Okay.
You don't have to approve the agenda.
Okay. So Layla, you're going to start by introducing a presentation from Echo Northwest. Is that correct?
Thank you. Yes, that is correct. So I'd like to just take a brief moment to both introduce the project and then the project team. As part of the city council goals that have been established for the city of Manzanita, we've been looking at opportunities to diversify the city's revenue streams. In order to do that, we reached out to a handful of economics firms and asked for some assistance and hired Echo Northwest to assist us in that effort. So I'm pleased to say we're joined today by Lorelei Gentinen, who is the president and CEO of Echo Northwest, as well as Deb Gallardi, who's been serving on that team as well. And so Lorelei is actually going to give you the real meat here. It's to kind of go over sort of what the team's charge was. So kind of looking at the city's current revenue streams, the services we provide, how things have changed over time, and then an evaluation of a range of different options, and then some discussion about next steps. So there's quite a bit of information here, and I know there's going to be a lot for us to learn. And so I think with that, I'm going to hand it over to Lorelei. She'll go through the presentation, and then there'll be time at the end of the presentation for discussion and questions. And before I do that, just real quickly, is we have been working with a sort of subcommittee of the budget committee. So our budget committee chair, Dave Dillon, and Chip Greening, as well as Councillor Spegman, have been working with me and a consultant team on what you're going to see today. So with that, I'll hand it over to Lorelei, and maybe Lorelei can take a moment to introduce yourself and the team as well.
Yeah, will do. And while I'm doing that, Layla, can you give me share screen abilities?
Sure can.
Hello, counselors. Great to see you.
Thank you for coming.
Yes, thank you. I'm Lorelei Jensen. I'm the president of Echo Northwest. We are an economics firm that's headquartered in Portland, and we do fiscal work and economic work for a range of municipalities up and down the West Coast. And I'm joined here today by Deb Ghilardi, who's a longtime Echo Northwest partner. And Deb, maybe you just want to say a couple things about yourself by way of introduction.
Sure. Deb Ghilardi, Ghilardi Rothstein Group, and I specialize in helping cities develop funding plans and fees for service for both infrastructure and general government services.
Okay, fantastic. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here and move this around so I can look at you and the presentation. That coming across okay for everybody? Mm-hmm. Okay, fantastic. So Layla's not wrong. I mean, just as a general rule, but in this specific instance that we have a lot to get through today. So I'm going to try to get through this presentation. If there's any questions that arise that really need immediate clarification, feel free to raise your hand and I'd be happy to address it as we're going through it. But if we can kind of withhold the majority of the discussion until we get through all of the content, I think that will help us to make sure that we can stay on time for you all. What we're hoping to get through today is some analysis that we've undertaken that helps to show why it's important to think about diversifying revenue streams for the city. And then we do have some preliminary options for some revenue tools that we might want to think about to share with you today. And also want to talk with you about the criteria that we would be using for assessing our options as we go forward. So I would say we're at the maybe 40% mark of the project here, where we have a good sense of the why we need to be doing this and a pretty good starting place on the what we might need to be doing, and are hoping to get your feedback to make sure that the next steps are directionally appropriate from your perspectives. So I'll start with this question of why diversify revenue streams, just to give away the punchline right from the very beginning. I will tell you that most Oregon cities, probably all Oregon cities, are facing fiscal challenges. Manzanita has all of those common problems, but you also have some special ones that are just Manzanita specific. So I'll walk through those. Some of those sort of special fiscal issues are related to the fact that your economy is built around tourism, and there are both costs and revenues associated with the management of tourism that need to be accounted for. And then last but not least, we'll walk through some of your current revenue sources and show our thinking about how they align with or do not align with where you've got some gaps in your ability to meet the core city functions that really all cities in Oregon are struggling to meet. So that's a big overview. I'll start with reassuring you that you are not alone in this challenge. We did some research polling information, budget information from cities and counties across the state of Oregon and projecting them forward relative to what we could understand about their costs, and found that across the board, cities are going to be struggling to meet their budgets over the course of the next 20 or 30 years. And the reasons for that are declining federal aid. That's been a historical truism for some time and may continue to be the case in the future. the constitutional limitations on property taxes that come from Measure 5 and Measure 50, which we'll be talking about a lot throughout this presentation, ongoing liabilities for funding PERS, and then just the general political challenges with implementing local revenue sources, many of which do require public votes to be able to enact. So this is the picture across the whole state, and is part of the picture for Manzanita as well. Looking at what we're calling a typical Oregon city, so if you sort of average it out across all of the cities and try to get into understanding the revenue sources that are coming in, for the most part, cities are reliant on the combination of user charges, which are roughly 40 to 42% of total revenue, and property taxes, which are typically in the 25-27% range. Both of those revenue sources have their own special limitations that all cities face. User charges are really only for specific uses, and are sized to meet the specific cost needs. So there's not additional revenue that's available through them generally. And then property taxes cannot grow by more than 3% per year on any property once it has come onto the tax rolls. And that's a constitutional limitation that all cities face. So that is part of the reason that we're seeing shortfalls across the whole state. Now we're going to get a little bit into the Manzanita special challenges. The property tax rate is very low at just 42 cents per $1,000 of assessed value. And we've kind of selected a random assortment of other cities. And you can see that in Astoria, it's quite a bit higher at $8 per thousand. Your friends in Nehalem at $1.47. And you can't raise that. You can't really do anything about that because it's frozen based on the timing of when Measure 5 and Measure 50 came into being. So you are starting in a place where you know there are going to be bigger gaps to fill than other cities face. So to just hit it home, those foundational sources of property taxes and user charges typically comprise about 75% of revenue. It's a much smaller percentage in Manzanita. Property taxes are just 9%, and those are limited. They're insufficient to cover infrastructure and city services. And then user charges, you don't have a lot of them right now in Manzanita. You do, however, have transient lodging tax, and that comprises 51% of your revenue. But even those have some limitations in that as you increase them, they must be spent, 70% of them must be spent on tourism. And then the revenues are primarily coming from overnight visitors, day users. There's not much of a way that they're contributing. So there's your big picture look at it. I want to talk a little bit about the fact that your economy is built around tourism and that drives some of the special challenges with your revenue picture. We've pulled this quote directly out of your comprehensive plan. Manzanita does not wish to be a major economic center. Manzanita's primary stimulus is in second homes and weekend and tourist businesses. And guess what? That is empirically true. We've pulled some data to help to show what that looks like. 76% of your units are considered vacant in the census, and of those that are vacant, nearly all of them are second and vacation homes. And that's a much higher proportion than you see in neighboring communities and certainly in the state as a whole. So that's that yellow bar at the top representing the vacant units, most of which are second and vacation homes. The share is actually holding relatively steady from 2000 to 2020. It has increased somewhat, but really pretty much steady on. This is a map that we made from your short-term rental permit data just to try to understand where short-term rentals are concentrated, primarily along the western portion of the city, obviously along the coastline. For those of you who walk around town, this is probably not much of a surprise to see this map, but we did think that it was helpful to sort of visualize where these units are concentrated. We pulled some data from a data source that we use regularly called Placer that tracks cell phone pings that allows us to see at a much more kind of granular level what flow through traffic is looking like. And what this graph is showing is the monthly visits to Manzanita by year from 2017 on. And you can really see those seasonal swings with the high points showing up in roughly around the 4th of July in the summertime, and low points in, right about now. And we're showing the pandemic beginning, and you can see that the patterns really did not change dramatically as a result of the pandemic. The big change is that there's more visitorship year round. The lows are not as low, but the highs are just as high. Most of those stays are overnight stays. The data source doesn't let us get into much more granularity than what we're showing here, but we do know that the average length of stay is more than 11 hours. So we know that most of the folks that are coming in to stay overnight. And then at the same time, when we look at full-time residents, the population has held essentially steady since 2000 of full-time residents at roughly around 600 folks. That means that the property tax revenue from those full-time residents is not growing sufficiently to cover costs, and in fact may be growing very little at all. Okay, so that helps to paint the picture of an economy that is based on tourism. I think we'll go now into some of the revenue sources and try to get a better picture of what that looks like. And here, I'm going to take the first crack at each of these slides and then give Deb a chance to jump in and clean up if there's anything that I've missed. She's been in the weeds on some pieces of this and may have some additional points to add to make sure that we're telling the full story. So what we're showing here on the left-hand side are the revenues that are flowing into the city, and on the right-hand side, where that money is going. So starting with the revenues, TLT is about 51%, of course, is paid entirely by visitors to the city, overnight visitors to the city. Licenses, fees, and permits are about 21%. And a lot of that is actually also paid by visitors because this is inclusive of the short-term rental permit costs or revenues that are flowing into the city. Property taxes at just 9%, and then you've got an assortment of other revenues that are there to help you meet your budget needs. On the expenditure side, a lot of it is going to capital expenses. So that would be the road fund, the city hall expansion, and then this facilities fund. General fund is about 28%. And then the largest single expenditure is going to the police department through the IGA that you all have regionally to manage public safety. Deb, anything you want to add on this slide? No. Okay. We thought it was helpful to just take a little bit of a look at how this has changed over time. What I was just showing you previously is a snapshot from 2021, but looking at how that has changed over time. The things that I really want to pull out here are this yellow bar in the middle are your property taxes. And so those hold very steady. As I noted, they're really not growing either in real terms or as a proportion of revenues. In fact, they're shrinking as a proportion of revenues. And this light blue line right here is the licenses, fees, and permits, and that has grown because of some increases in permit fees. And then what's really growing is the transient lodging tax. So you can see that blue bar at the bottom getting larger over time. We wanted to dig in a little bit more deeply into the road fund specifically to start to really illustrate some of the challenges that are faced with meeting the core services that the city is trying to operate. Deb, can I hand it to you to take these next few slides?
You can. In digging into the road fund really does provide a good place to see some of the existing issues around both the alignment of revenues with costs and whether existing funding sources result in businesses, residents, and visitors paying for the services proportionate to the benefits that they receive. So first, the road fund is designated as a special revenue fund, which means that there are revenues that the city receives from the state that are designated for specific purposes. In the case of the road fund, Manzanita gets a per capita share of state revenue from fuel taxes to fund maintenance and improvements within the right-of-way. The other main source of funding for ongoing road maintenance is the franchise fees paid by other utilities like Tillamook PUD. Indirectly, both of these funding sources results from payments made by residents and businesses, including transient lodging businesses and second homeowners, through fuel taxes and payments to the PUD. However, unlike the water fund, which I think, as you know, is an enterprise fund of the city, the road fund is not self-supporting. So the pie chart shows the portion of revenues generated by each funding source, and that a portion of the revenues, now looking at 2022-23 budget year, are not being met by recurring revenues, but instead by carryover balances from the prior year. So part of the problem for road maintenance funding across the state is that, like property taxes, fuel tax rates have not been increased and revenues have been impacted by higher movement to higher efficiency vehicles, and in the case of Manzanita, slow population growth. Okay, let's go to the next slide there. So given the limited road fund specific revenues do not even cover the annual operations and maintenance costs of the system, capital improvements have been fully funded, as you can see here, by transfers from the general fund over the last several years. So unlike the revenue sharing from state fuel taxes and franchise fees, which are paid by all users of the system, the general fund revenues are those that are primarily the result of overnight visitor revenues from the TLT, as Lorelei said, and the short-term rental permit fees. Next slide. So looking into the future, even with the significant transfers from the general fund the city has been making to cover these capital improvement costs in the past, the same level of transfer is not sustainable or sufficient in the future. The city is undergoing a transportation system plan update, and it has identified $2.5 million over the next 20 years to improve safety and efficiency for all modes of travel for all users of the system. So that means residents, businesses, visitors. And currently there are no sustainable funding mechanisms for these improvements, particularly for current residents, because this is all being funded right now through those transfers. So that's our deep dive into just give you just a slice of the budget funding picture. And if you want to go to the next slide, so basically from the information that Lorelei presented, as well as, looking at the road fund, you see that part of the challenge here is that visitor second homeowner spending drives very much of the fiscal picture, certainly in terms of revenue. There are absolutely costs associated with managing a tourist economy, but the resident population currently produces insufficient revenue to cover the infrastructure and other core costs, because there aren't fees like on the water system that recover a cost from a broad base of users, including existing residents. Okay, next slide. So part of the solution, at least in part of the opportunity, would be to address the needs in the transportation with more sustainable revenue sources to cover increases in maintenance costs as well as future capital improvements, and then continuing to look for ways to manage the tourism-based economy, which include code enforcement, trash collection, finding a mechanism for day trippers to also contribute to the revenue. So I'll turn it back to Lorelei.
Okay, that was a lot of information. The elevator summary of all of that is you aren't alone. Every city is facing revenue challenges. your revenue challenges are complicated by managing a tourism economy, but even absent the tourists and the contributions that they're already making, the city is in a position where it has a very, very low property tax rate and would be struggling to achieve the core services that are needed to serve even existing residences. And so what's happening is general fund dollars are being used to backfill all of these other much needed sources. And additionally, there are things that are needed that there's not funding available for. Hence, the title slide back at the very beginning of needing to search for opportunities to diversify revenue, and then landing on this slide of saying, where are the real gaps that need to be met? We are seeing them as being in the transportation system and in finding ways to make sure that we're funding a tourism-based economy, primarily through looking at getting contributions from day trippers. So I'm going to pause for just a second before we dive into the next section, which is looking at some of the potential solutions that we can continue to explore over the next part of the process here. Layla, can you help me manage this part? I can see that there's a hand risen, but I can't tell who it is while I'm sharing the screen.
Yeah, sure. I think this is a work session, so we'll just take comment, I think, from the council. I'll turn to the mayor on how to manage
Okay,
other
thank you.
hands raised. Yeah, thanks.
I'm going to jump in with a question. This was a very impressive presentation so far. Thank you. Can you give an example? I know this is backtracking. Can you give an example of user charges, something that we don't see in Manzanita, but we see in other cities?
Yeah, and I might actually let Deb talk about this. We're going to talk about this one a little bit more specifically as we get into the forward-looking one, because we're thinking about a transportation utility fee. But Deb, maybe you want to just give some broader examples.
Sure. Yeah. Because so many cities are facing the same sorts of issues, and transportation, like a water system or a sewer system, has personnel, operation, and maintenance ongoing costs. It's one of those systems that is particularly well suited to a user fee. That is, you would set up an enterprise fund, basically the same as water, and you would collect fees specifically for that service, which would then be designated to fund those costs. And some cities have also done, park user fees, stormwater user fees, all specific. It's basically a fee for that specific service. And it can also include general government services like public safety. There are a number of communities in Oregon that have public safety service fees.
Thank you.
All right. Shall we roll forward into the next part of the presentation here? Okay. So here is the first thing that we would like to get your feedback on. As we move into contemplating specific tools that you all might consider for revenue diversification, for adding revenue, we will need to think about how we're evaluating them. And these are the criteria that we are proposing that we would use for the remainder of our analysis. And we'd love to get your feedback on them, on whether they feel like they're directionally appropriate and are hitting on all of the most important points. So funding capacity, are we actually addressing the challenges that we've identified here? And is it a sufficient amount of money to help? Stability, how much does this funding fluctuate from year to year? Can you count on it? Fairness, who benefits and who pays, and is that proportionate to who's imposing the costs? Flexibility, is it so narrowly tied to only one use that it may not be useful to fill the overall gap? Ease of administration, some revenue tools are extremely expensive to implement because they require new data or require burdensome administrative tools to be able to implement. Neutrality, this one is a little bit hard to wrap your head around, but let me make an attempt at it. An example of this would be a toll, which yes, collects revenue and yes, can be applied to transportation infrastructure, but might cause behavior change where people would change their driving patterns to avoid the toll in such a way that it actually affects the revenue potential of the tool. So this question of neutrality is, does the option influence behavior or create unintended consequences? And then last but not least, definitely not least, is ease of implementation. Many of these tools require voter approval or may need to have legal analysis in order to be implemented. And we would want to take that into consideration. So a question, if these are the things that we're thinking about as we're evaluating tools, does it feel like we're hitting on the right set of criteria? Grandfather clock agrees.
I have a question about fairness in a tourism-based economy. Does that exist?
Fairness is in the eye of the beholder. Is that your question?
Yeah.
Well, I think the way to think about this really is who's imposing the costs and who is paying for the costs. And certainly tourists are contributing quite a lot at the moment to your overall revenue picture. 51% of the incoming revenue is from TLT alone, and they're also contributing in other ways, indirect ways. So I think the question for us to grapple with in the application of that particular criteria is that proportionate to the costs that are imposed by tourists, and how does that also line up against the core services that would need to be provided to the city, whether it was a tourist-based economy or not, and what are the contributions from the existing residents and through property taxes?
Okay.
It is a question to grapple with for sure.
I think the rest of them look great.
Okay.
Laura, can you explain a little bit further what sort of voter approval tasks, what sort of projects would require voter approval to implement?
Yeah, why don't I just roll ahead to the next part of the presentation,
Okay.
and then you can keep these criteria in your mind as we go through it. And if something occurs to you, by all means, raise your hand and let us know that relate to the criteria. But I want to get to that question, and the easiest way to get to it is to dig into some of the tools that seem to be coming to the top right now. So what we've done so far is have pulled a list of potential revenue options to contemplate, and it's a pretty long list, and have had some conversations with Layla and with the committee that she mentioned at the top of the presentation to make an initial narrowing of that tool to the ones that seem to have the best nexus to the challenge that we're facing. And so this is where we are landing, pending this discussion and pending the remainder of the analysis. A general, and I'm going to walk through each of these and kind of describe what they are, describe what it takes to get them in place, let Deb clean up anything that I missed, let Layla jump in if there's anything that she thinks that I've missed, and hopefully get to your question as I go through these tools. So the first is a general obligation bond. These do require a vote of the residents, of the property holders, of the residents, not the property owners. And it is a tax that is levied on properties, and it is for a dollar amount. So you need to line up a dollar amount with a specific set of projects that you want to be able to build. It is for capital only. And what happens is property taxes are increased by the amount that's needed to be able to pay off the bond and achieve implementation or construction of those projects. We've called it transportation infrastructure here. You can use a general obligation bond really for any kind of a capital expense. Transportation feels like it's the one that's the most obvious need for the city of Manzanita. So that's one option. Transportation utility fee is a fee that's charged on your utility bill. And here we would say that it would be used for transportation maintenance and infrastructure. So it's collected monthly through an existing mechanism. The next one is a prepared food and beverage sales tax, always a controversial discussion. And so obviously a lot more discussion to be had before we move forward with any of these. But there are examples of places where these have been implemented in Oregon. It would require a voter approval. It is a sales tax just on prepared foods, and it could be used for a range of things, but we're suggesting that this would help to match with tourism management as well as potentially with transportation infrastructure costs. And then another one that's very controversial, we're not afraid to step on the third rail here, is parking fees. Always gets to be a very interesting discussion when those come up, but you do have a parking management problem. You do have high traffic areas and you do have peak volumes. And so, and you do not have mechanisms that collect people who are just here, collect revenues from people who are just going through town for a couple of hours. So a parking fee could help you to achieve some revenue sources that would help to manage tourism and potentially support transportation infrastructure maintenance as well. So I'll pause on that. Deb, what do you want to clean up on that overview?
No, I think you hit all the key items.
Okay.
Lorelei, can I just check you on one thing?
Sure.
You said the prepared food and beverage tax would require voter approval, and I know you can certainly do that by voter approval, but couldn't you also do that by council vote?
I don't believe you can.
I thought they did in Cannon Beach.
No, they didn't do it in Cannon Beach, but the city manager, I know I had a conversation with him, and he expressed that they could have and they should have, and if they did, the Oregon Restaurant Association wouldn't have entered into the conversation with an aggressive lobbying campaign. And he thought that the city council was, basically negligent in not stepping up. That was his opinion. It's not necessarily my opinion, but he regretted that they didn't do it by council vote. But anyway, we can certainly check.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an attorney and I don't even play one on TV, so I'm not going to pretend to be able to give you a definitive answer to that question. But my understanding has been that it requires a vote, and we should definitely check with an attorney and confirm that that's the case.
Okay.
Lorelei, I had a question about particularly developers covering some costs on road improvements. We have a major development that's gone in up here with hundreds of houses, and at this point, it looks like the residents are going to be supporting maintenance of that road. Is that something that you looked at as well?
Are you referring to systems development charges?
No, not necessarily. Something, no. Developer, some pathway for developers to contribute to roads that are being used by, we don't have roads under our system development charges, for one thing. So it just seems like, is there a way to capture some proportionate contribution from developers when they build a large development and a majority, of those cars come on to city streets?
Yeah, I mean that's what a system development charge would do.
We don't have it for transportation or roads. We don't have roads.
The other mechanism that you will see in some places, especially where there's large lot development with many units that have their own sort of transportation infrastructure to serve that development, is effectively an HOA for transportation maintenance. That doesn't feel like it would be appropriate in Manzanita, but that is a way that you can think about having specific revenue tied into maintenance for roads. But systems development charges are meant to be scaled for, to provide revenue to cover the incremental cost to the system of new development occurring, and could certainly be something that could be considered.
Is there a way to capitalize on the vacant homes? I know that there's this idea out there maybe about like taxing empty homes. I don't know, but is there a way to like maybe add a bucket of how to capitalize on those vacation?
I'm going to say talk to your state legislator on that one, because that one is a kind of above the pay grade of the city of Manzanita and would require state action. One of the challenges that we have is that we don't actually even know. We have census data that gives us some sense of second homes, but we don't have a registry to know which homes are technically second homes to even begin to think about a mechanism to extract revenue from them. That is certainly something that has been discussed as a possibility for statewide legislative change, but to my knowledge, I mean, there's 2,000 bills that are proposed for this legislative session. To my knowledge, there's not one in there on that particular topic this year. We have another slide that gets into these four from a slightly different angle. So let's keep rolling through this and see what additional questions arise. So what we're getting at here is the starting to get at that fun question of fairness for each of these four revenue options that we're talking about. So who pays directly and who pays indirectly? So for the general obligation bond, the people who are paying are the property owners, and that's all the property owners, whether they're second and vacation homes, short-term rentals, or long-term residents, or businesses, or industrial properties. Any property owner would be contributing to that. Indirectly, though, for any of those properties that are second homes or are short-term renters or are even businesses, the tourist economy is providing an indirect payment source for those increases. Similarly, for transportation and utility fees, property owners are the ones who would be paying. It's that full gamut of property owners. But indirectly, you would see overnight and day visitors would be contributing to that. Prepared food and beverage sales tax, people who are buying prepared food, regardless of where they come from, are the ones who would be paying for that. And then parking fees. Visitors to paid parking zones, I would say that there are mechanisms that I have seen used that would exempt full-time residents or other classes of people from parking fees and try to target it more at visitors, but that's getting into kind of program design. If you're just thinking about it in a more generic term, it's pretty much anybody who's in a paid parking zone that would be contributing. Deb, anything to add there?
So I just have a question that I just don't have the answer to. And you talk about paid parking, and you also talk about the value of making sure that administrative costs, setup costs, and post-administrative costs. Have you looked at those and made sure that the parking is something that there'll be a significant revenue, will become a significant revenue minus cost?
No, not yet. That would be something that we would do in the next phase of kind of thinking about and evaluating these tools.
Okay. And then lastly, when you're looking at property owners, you're really talking about 80% of people who are not full-time here and only 17% of the people that live here. So the cost burden would be significantly on those people who have second homes or who have short-term rentals. Is that correct?
Yep.
I think that's an important thing to look at when you're deciding whether to go forward with those.
Noted. Thank you.
And that's one of the things that'll come up in the next phase too, is looking at, in projecting revenue, we'll be identifying, kind of making those estimates as to what segments are paying also.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So we're bringing forward some specific discussion questions here to help to shape the next phase of our analysis. I should say that our sort of scope of work and budget gives us the ability to do projections on up to 4 sources, but that doesn't mean that we can't consider additional ones. So like, for example, systems development charges could certainly be part of our longer term recommendations. But what we want to make sure that we're doing is getting feedback on the ones that you all want us to really dig into and like really kind of try to do some revenue projections on and run through those evaluation criteria. So what we'd like to hear from you all now is really, what are your biggest concerns with these options? Do they feel like they're the right ones? Are they addressing the biggest unmet needs? What questions are remaining in your minds that you'd like to have us dig into as we continue the rest of this analysis?
Well, Lauralee, I have a question about parking fees. Is this traditionally are you talking parking meters, that something that's like on Lanita? And I mean, we don't have a lot of property to develop a big parking lot like Cannon Beach has, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm trying to see where that would even go.
Yeah, I mean, this is a thing that we would want to continue to consider over the next little while as we're doing the evaluation, but parking meters are probably the way to go.
Comment nowadays, that would make a lot of park.
Okay, I think you muted partway through and disappeared.
Oh, yep, sorry.
Yeah, that was sorry. I think members of council are, I'll defer to the mayor, but members of council are permitted to speak. And that was not a member of council.
Okay, yep, sorry.
Great.
Lauralee, as far as the potential to raise revenue, when I'm looking at this chart, am I assuming that the largest revenue raisers would be on the left and the smallest revenue raisers would be on the right?
That's probably accurate.
Okay.
Yep, GO bonds are for, like I said, generally large dollar amounts that are needed to fund capital improvements upfront. So you need to have, I don't know, $8 million to do a specific project. That would be an example of the kind of thing that you would fund with the GO bond. And then the increases in property taxes are over time to pay off that upfront amount.
And then the transportation utility fee, that just goes on forever, basically?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay.
And just a quick note on that. So Bay City does a transportation utility fee of $10 a month, and that goes straight into their road fund. And they did that via resolution.
And what kind of revenue does that raise? Do you have any idea?
I can find out, but it's not insignificant. We did a back of the envelope calculation here. It's a 6-figure number annually.
Okay.
That's
So
part of what the team will look at next. Sorry, Jerry.
I just wanted to certainly agree with Brad's right to left observation. But the problem, of course, is that the boxes on the left hit up the folks that are already paying quite a bit. The boxes on the right are trying to get to the day trippers. So I think they all have merit on the menu here and need to be explored with the criteria that you laid out earlier. Obviously, that some of that criteria may knock down any one of these, but even if the left ones are the juicy ones, the right ones might be the more equitable ones to be paying some, at least as much attention to. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I really appreciate you bringing that up, because it may be that we want to think about applying the criteria across multiple tools. It's always the case in doing fiscal work that there's no silver bullet. There's no one tool that's going to magically solve all of the problems that a city faces. And we may need to be thinking about a combination of revenue tools.
Lauralee, how does the transportation utility fee work?
Yeah, Deb, I'll let you jump in on that one.
Sure. Yeah, it's so like with your water rates, you establish what the annual revenue need is, and then you go about designing the fee to recover on a monthly basis as part of that utility fee statement the charges from each type of customer. And there's a whole lot that goes into the design of the fees and how you determine what should, or, this gets at the question about fairness and how you determine what a residential customer should pay versus a business, and within businesses, should all businesses pay the same? So there are lots of questions that go into the fee design, but it functions just like the water rates, except in this case, we don't have the ability to measure use specifically. We know how much water you use because your water meter measures that. For transportation, we have to use industry averages that speak to the trips generated on average by different types of users. And as I think was noted, that is a council action. It does not require vote other than by council.
Right. So if you decided you wanted to move forward with the transportation utility fee, a follow-on step after this study is complete would be to do the kind of study that Deb described to determine the specific rate and really get very specific about how it would be implemented.
And a key part of that would be, I think, looking at it, developing a financial plan for the transportation system so that you could identify what other funding sources, like a systems development charge, could be used for the capital component, what ongoing operation and maintenance needs there are, and that, looking to, so you could right size the fee based on the specific requirements.
Yeah, the timing for that is actually really great given the TSP work that's going on right now. It'd be well set up to continue that conversation if that's a path that makes sense to the council.
So would one of your recommendations be that we do an SDC for roads? Is that something that would come out of your recommendation?
That's an example of the kind of recommendation that we would be making in the next phase of research.
Okay, great. And in looking at these, are these the best options you came up with? Are there other options that you processed?
Yeah, I mean, we did a preliminary look at a wide range of options and kind of narrowed it to this for the sake of these four, to the sake of this conversation, to get your feedback on it through conversations with the budget committee and with your city manager, because it felt like these were the ones that had the best nexus to the specific revenue challenge that we were seeing in the data. And because they feel like they have across the range of them, they're hitting on those equity pieces of who's paying and who's benefiting.
And part of it is these would be new funding sources. You already have systems development charges, though if there's not one currently for transportation, it's certainly mentioned in the transportation system plan as a funding mechanism that you should consider. And as Lorelei said, there's no better time to update it's just like you did for the stormwater master plan that you just adopted, and you at the same time adopted or are in the process of adopting an SDC for stormwater. So same would apply. I think you're in the final stages of the TSP, and then you would be an excellent time to estimate what that, or to develop that SDC for transportation.
Well, and transportation would be roads, but it'd also be walking paths, and it's the broader picture.
Yes, yep. It's all modes of travel. Exactly.
Okay.
I had a question about the timeline. You're just digging into these things, and you said you were 40% to step one, I think. What are you looking at time-wise with this program?
So, cue the next slide. Thank you for that wonderful lead-in.
Leads in.
So assuming that this feels like it's headed in the right direction, our next analytic steps are going to be to do some rough initial revenue projections for these 4 options and to run them through the criteria and to turn those into a set of recommendations for what your next steps might be around revenue diversification, and present those to council. And then from there, we would produce a final report that documents all of this and turn it back over to y'all to take the next steps or not that are included in those recommendations.
Is that a 6-month process, a year process?
Well, we're hypothetically on the agenda for your next meeting in April to talk about the findings and the revenue projections, but need to true that up with Layla and make sure that all works out. Great. So no, we're hoping it's not a 6-month process. We're hoping that it's more of a 2 or 3 month process.
Great.
That's pretty exciting. Mm-hmm. So will you include the administrative costs of developing these as well, in terms of your criteria, so that we'll have all of those numbers to look at?
We can probably get some examples of administrative costs from other communities that have used these tools for you, but you will really need to be digging into the specific programmatic implementation to understand precisely what the administrative costs will look like.
So that would be a Layla question then.
And it would be a follow-up after you decide that you want to take action on one of these tools. There's not a lot of reason to get to that level of detail until you feel confident that that's a path you want to walk down.
Okay.
Yeah.
Lorelei, can I just ask you, with regard to the food and beverage tax, and trying to do a projection, how much of a challenge is it for you if we have a significant new development on Lanita that could expect to be a big purveyor of food and beverages, but it's just under construction, not even yet. So can you account for something like that, or?
I think I know the one you're talking about, and there are examples of other ones like that up and down the coast and across the state that we could look at as an example.
Good.
Okay. Anything else in this conversation here? What are we missing?
So what do you need in terms of next steps?
If any of you have any major red flags on the direction that this is going based on this presentation, we'd love to hear that now before we get into developing your recommendations. Otherwise, just sort of giving us the thumbs up to continue walking down the path that we're on.
Can I ask what kind of outreach happens, like to chat? I've been to a couple of meetings where restaurant owners were strongly opposed to a food and beverage tax. So, I mean, is outreaching to the community a part of what you do as well?
Well,
or not?
What I would say is, and Layla, you should jump in on this too, but what we will be providing for you is the rationale for why you might consider moving into implementing a food and beverage tax, and maybe some thoughts about the next steps that you should take. And those next steps probably should include some engagement or community discussion.
Yes, that's exactly right.
Great, thank you. Yeah, we're trying to give you the foundation on which to, feel comfortable that you're moving in the right direction.
Well, there's a lot to process there, and some surprises. I mean, I wasn't expecting parking fees, and I wasn't expecting a food and beverage tax. So I think we have some things to discuss here. Is there any other questions or comments for Deb or Layla? Lorelei?
Well, just generally speaking, is the council comfortable with us proceeding with those 4 as identified so that the team can proceed with that? I think that's what we're looking for. I'm guessing that's the case, so I just want to make sure.
So from my standpoint, I think you've done a good job of identifying funding alternatives over a broad base. I like the fact that you divided it into what would a property owner would be responsible for. That gives us a good discussion point to talk about. I also like the fact that you are going for day trippers that come in, and the two options that you propose have been discussed in a number of different formats and appear to be good ways of getting funding from the day trippers. So I would love to discuss further these options and learn more about the implications of each. And so from my standpoint, I think you've done a great job.
Thank you. Great. Okay.
I agree with Linda.
Other comments?
Well, so I was on the subcommittee that helped come up with this short list, and I certainly am supportive of it. But I agree with Deb that none of these happens without serious work by this council and this community to come to grips with our realities, our fiscal realities. And so this process can give us the good analytical and statistical foundation, but the heavy lifting is on us, not on this group of consultants. I appreciate their work, and I think it'll certainly set us up to move forward and do good things, smart things. But we're going to do it, not a report from the consultants, and they know that. And I appreciate the process. I think it's working well.
Yeah, we do have a work cut out for us.
Mm-hmm. I was curious too, Lorelei, about for example, I'm over on the right side with those parking meters. You bring to us the cost as well as the benefit, right? The expenditures, what the investment cost is, and what the return's going to be, and how long it takes to pay for something. Some of those things that we would implement.
There are a lot of programmatic choices and even kind of software choices that would have to be made to implement this, that we won't be getting into that level of detail.
Okay.
But we can pull some information from other communities that have implemented these kinds of things and give you some examples of kind of what your choice set will look like and what the cost and revenues could look like.
Okay. So then it's up to us to do that research and that homework. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you would need to make some policy choices and also some program design choices before you could possibly make those kinds of estimates at that level of detail.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, I do know I've had some conversations with Layla, and I think she has some particular experience in some of these things. So I think we'll be able to come up to speed fairly quickly.
So thank you, Linda. It looks like we'll be seeing you again in April. Is that right? You're on the agenda going forward?
I'm kind of looking at Layla. I think so, yes. But
April 12th. Yeah. We'll have you back at the work session on
that
April 12th.
Sounds wonderful. And we'll be ready for it.
Thank you both for your time.
No doubt. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Good work. Thank you.
Have a good rest of your meeting.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lorelei. Thanks, Deb.
You bet.
The next item on the agenda is the indirect cost methodology. And Layla, I didn't know if you wanted to kick that off. There was quite a write-up in the counselor packet. But it also shows that a vote for this would be perhaps tentative in the city council meeting later tonight. So what kinds of things do we need to determine here to determine where we go at the next meeting?
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to, so I wrote up, there's a memo there's a staff report, a pretty detailed staff report. I wanted to use a work session as a chance to just go through the presentation again and see if there's general consensus among the council to move forward with adopting a policy to use this methodology. So I thought we could do this at the work session. The council feels like they want to use maybe a different methodology, that they want to do something different than this. I wanted you to have the option to postpone that vote on the methodology if you didn't feel that you're ready to do that today. Although we have talked about this quite a lot, so my hope is that we'll get there. So in the interest of time, we did this in a work session so that when you get to the city council meeting, you won't have to spend a whole lot of time on this. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and I've prepared presentation. I have a new computer, so you have to bear with me. Okay. So do you just see the presentation now?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right, so a lot of this will look familiar to you. But let's just start again for the benefit of the public. So what are indirect costs? Well, indirect costs are costs of doing business that is not readily identified with a specific activity, but it's necessary for the operation of the program or service. So the City of Manzanita as an umbrella organization has, and I'll show a slide here, some enterprise funds within the city that require administrative overhead and services. So, just to kind of answer this, it's a bit unusual to be talking about this particular methodology at the level of detail that this city has sort of done that. But that's okay. I think the more that we have out in the public realm and how we talk about these things in terms of the assumptions we make with respect to the budgeting process, that more information is better. So you're learning about something that most cities kind of just take for granted, because who does it? Every city that has an enterprise fund, for the most part, at least every city I worked for, does some form of indirect cost transfer for enterprise funds where the administration provides overhead services. And the City of Manzanita is no different.
Hey, Layla.
The City of Manzanita, sure, yes.
Can you tell me the difference between an enterprise fund and a construction fund?
So an enterprise fund is, so the water system is a good example of that. It generates revenue through fees, and those fees are used to operate and maintain the system. A capital project fund is specific to a capital project. So you get money and it's for a specific project, whereas an enterprise fund, you charge rates to provide a service, and then those rates pay for the provision of that service.
The reason I ask, I guess, is I was looking back at when you were comparing the funds that came out or the projections for this next budget cycle versus what came out last year. And it looked like, according to the wording, this budget cycle, it would come from the Water Enterprise Fund and the Building Enterprise Fund, whereas the last cycle, some of it came from the Water Enterprise Fund, some came from the Water Construction Fund, and some came from the Building Enterprise Fund.
Correct. And the Water Construction Fund, so the methodology we used last year, so you can get indirect transfers for the administration of construction projects. So the number that was estimated for last year's budget included all the construction costs for Dorcas, because the administration actually oversees all the construction administration and then the payments of all of those things. And so that was included in the analysis. So you actually look at both capital funds as well as enterprise funds to do transfers like that. The city has only done transfers for the water fund and for the building fund, so the enterprise funds. Okay. But last year, yes, we did propose a transfer for the construction fund because of the size and scale of that. And the model that we used last year generated that. And that's not, that's a $1.3 million project. And I think the transfer that was proposed was in the $40,000 range.
You're right. Thanks.
You bet. And you'll see with the outputs of this model, it looks different because we use the different methodologies. So again, cities that have these types of funds do this. There are a lot of ways to calculate it. So it really is no silver bullet here, not to overuse the term, but the city has historically always accounted for the administration's overhead through once upon a time, they used was recovered as a percentage of the city manager's salary. So I went back and actually looked at budgets from 1991, 92, 93, 94, 95, and onward. Up until 4 years ago, the way that the budget officers, so the city managers that were here during those times, did that was that they allocated a portion of the city manager's salary to the water fund. So the water fund paid percentage of the city manager's salary. About 4 years ago, the city manager, Cynthia Alamello, took a different approach. So she hired an economics firm to do an analysis using cost drivers to determine indirect costs. She recognized really that the city had shifted from this more simplified version of FTE, so the full-time equivalent of the city manager's salary, because it's really not the way that the city worked. And so the intent there was to kind of come up with a more transparent methodology for determining those costs. And so the city hired the FCS group to develop a model and use that for the last several years. The budget committee, so since I've been here, I utilize that methodology for the budget process last year. We've had a number of different conversations about this. So everything that we're talking about with respect to the indirect cost study has been done in public, transparently. So we're really trying to just be very clear about, we need to figure out a way to identify costs. There's a number of different ways. Let's agree on a way that works, that makes sense. And the budget committee felt like the FCS analysis was fine and acceptable, but it was complex. It wasn't easy to intuit or understand. Frankly, I read it. I got lots of training on it. I feel about 90% confident in my understanding of it, but it's pretty complex. And so the budget committee asked us, gave direction to staff to explore a simpler model. And this actually occurred prior to my coming here. And so we analyzed a number of different processes, and the budget committee gave direction to staff to explore the Warrenton's materials and services model. We had discussions about this 4 times over the last year. So I just want to, and those are the meetings in which that was discussed, if anyone's interested in looking back. So as I said, indirect costs, the administration really is all funded by the general fund. City Hall, parks, police, roads, all of those things are generally funded by the general fund. But the building fund, the water utility, SDC funds, and tourism actually have separate funding sources, but the city still provides a lot of overhead services to these different funds. So the model that we're using is based on the Warrenton model, which basically says that the level of materials and services that are spending by each department is a reasonable proxy for the administrative, finance, and overhead support for that fund or department. It's a pretty simple thesis. One could argue it. And again, there's no silver bullet here. This is just one example of, I talked about 3 ways that the city could look at this, and there's certainly more. So when we do this, all we do really is we start with adding up all the materials and services spending for every fund to get a total M&S for the city. We identify and remove any unusual or non-recurring expenditures to avoid distortions. And then we calculate each fund, their departmental share of the total M&S. So of the total spending in the entire city, what percentage does each department contribute in terms of their spending? And then we get a factor for that, and we apply that to the, so that's the factor there, as you can see, of the overall spending of each department in total dollars, and then as a percentage of total. That factor then gets applied to both the city's administration's overhead materials and services. So that's that $179,000 you see there. So that's the city's M&S. And it gets allocated based on the percentage of M&S of all the departments. Then we also look at personnel. So I oversee every transaction that comes through the city, the accounting manager, and the assistant city recorder. So for this model, what I did was I took a very conservative approach to the FTE that's allocated to this model and said, okay, what percentage of time do we really spend on administration? So those are things that are specific to kind of the financial administration of the city. And it's really hard to pin down kind of how I spend my time because it's so broad and it changes every moment. But I would say probably about a third of my time is really focused on administration related items. So that's everything from viewing the budget to payroll to bills for payment and on and on and on. So instead of having my full FTE accounted for in this model, I actually only accounted for 0.3 of my FTE. I put the full FTE in for the accounting manager because 100% of her job is the city's finances. And so that seemed to me a reasonable estimate. And then finally, I did an estimate for the assistant city recorder's position and assumed about a quarter of her position is really dedicated to council support. So with those assumptions, and that gives us a total sort of administrative overhead cost per staff, and then using that M&S spending rate, we allocate those expenses across the different funds. And so that's what we did here. And that's the final numbers that we come up with that would be essentially the basis for a proposal in the budget for a transfer. So from the building fund, we would propose to transfer $27,332. And from the water operations fund, it would be $191,727. So that's how the M&S model works. This was presented to the budget committee, and there was general consensus to bring this forward to the city council, who sets the policy for the city to consider. Again, normally this is something a budget officer would propose as part of the budget, but I think that given the amount of attention that this has received, that having the council discuss this and then make a formal policy around how to make this estimate would be very beneficial for the budget officer to do as they move forward with the budget. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions or entertain a discussion of council and see if your comfort level with this approach is high enough that you would like to move forward with the vote this evening.
Layla, I had a question on the memo that you put out, action requested and the analysis and what are the indirect costs. I highlighted that you have to manage the calendar, consult with the mayor, prepare an agenda, produce documents such as draft resolutions or ordinance, explain proposals, record meetings, produce minutes, answer councilors' questions, and post meeting information on the website. That's all. Those are your words, I think, from, yeah.
Yeah, I don't have it in front of me, so
okay,
I'll trust that that's the case.
So when
Is there a question?
I went back to July and I looked at the agendas for all of the meetings, and there was one mention of the water on the July 19th. There's a land use hearing on the appeal of the Dorcas Avenue, but that's really a water construction problem or fund, not the water department. But the only other one I found anything on was a renewal of, this was in December, renewal of Public Works Equipment Fund. So I'm just having trouble. I have trouble with that huge amount being taken out of the water fund, water department, when it's kind of barely breaking even. And I'm having trouble understanding why the water department management is so much more costly than, say, the public service, the police force, for example.
So your question is what is your question?
Why is the water department so administratively heavy in cost as opposed to the police department, for example, when you've got pretty much the same number of employees and process similar amount of invoices, et cetera?
That's actually categorically untrue. We process significantly more invoices for the water department to the tune of about 50% of all of the financial transactions that occur in the city are for the water department. And that's clearly indicated in the analysis that shows the materials and services spending on average for the last 5 years results in about 50%. So I think that's a pretty clear indication in terms of the complexity. The water system requires far more oversight than the police department for that reason. And they operate infrastructure. There's a lot more issues related to property and insurance. So it's significant. And I think that just a good clean look at the budget would really clearly show why that's the case.
They do have their own billing person, is that correct? The water department?
That is correct, but every penny flows through the administration. The administration manages all of the water funds. But the utility clerk does sends out the bills. That is correct.
Mm-hmm. And then figured into this also is computers and equipment, desks, and things like that. Is that correct?
I think that's not necessarily a clear way to describe it. As I mentioned, an indirect cost is a cost of doing business that's not readily identified with the specific activity. So you could say that some of the cost, materials, and services that this model uses gets at those overhead costs for the administration. And I think I used an example earlier. I was talking with someone and trying to express kind of, it's a sticky thing. It's indirect. There's no direct, right? Like there's this idea that, oh, I can just write a timesheet. And I'm sorry, but that is not realistic, nor is it possible. Because what we're trying to account for is something beyond just straight time. If it were that, it'd be a lot easier. It'd be straightforward. This is something that I think all businesses struggle with. And so what we're really trying to do is come to an agreement on what is the best methodology to make sure that the water department, the water system is paying for the services that are provided to it. So I think saying we're taking money away from the water department presumes that we're not doing anything. We provide a significant amount of oversight and have a great deal of responsibility for the water system. So an example is the water system, for example, they pay their insurance premium, right? They pay the insurance premium on their property. Who negotiates that? That would be me. Who's involved in that? Me and Nina. And then there's contracting that goes along with that. How do you account for that in an M&S or an hourly basis? So that's one example of like a million different things that relate to that. So payroll, Nina processes payroll. I approve payroll. I evaluate salaries. I work with those hours are spread out all across the entire year. It's hard to account for those things, but we pay for that payroll. We do all the reports. We're the ones that sign off on all of that. those are the kinds of indirect costs. If you're trying to say it's just a straight time, hour to hour, or this desk is getting paid for, you're missing the point and you don't understand. And so that's part of what I'm trying to communicate to the community is indirect costs are costs that we cannot readily identify. So what we just need is a methodology that people can understand and are comfortable with to take care of this. Because we do need to make sure that the general fund is solvent, and subsidizing a water fund that can actually raise revenue to cover its own sources, it doesn't seem to make financial or good policy sense. Okay. Linda, you're muted.
So how long has Warrenton used this model? And I'm sure you talked to them. What was their, what did they feel about utilization of this model?
They've used it since 2003. I know that Nina's had a few conversations with their assistant finance director. I know that Chip Greening from our budget committee has had a few conversations with them. So they've used it successfully. Again, this isn't usually something that rises to the level of 7 public meetings. So they've used it for over 20 years.
And they've been audited, right?
I presume so. Yeah, I'm not up to speed on
and an
what the
auditor
financial
would have
statements are.
Presented an issue if there were an issue with their system, I'm sure.
I would have, yeah, I don't know.
Okay.
I know other cities I've worked in all have used an indirect cost method and had different cost drivers. It's different no matter where you go.
I know coming from private industry, it's a hard issue. I mean, it's a hard issue to develop and to put across all your lines of business. It's never easy, and it's not identifiable. It is the indirect things that you do that the administration does for each of the departments. So I think the budget committee has had a chance to look at this, I believe, and has
4 times, yeah,
and has felt like it was a good methodology and appropriate to use, and certainly worth trying. The FCS, we went to FCS because we wanted a more specific and analytical evaluation of indirect costs. It turned out to be a good way to do it, but way too complex for us to follow easily. This seems much more direct, much easier to follow, and if Warrenton has used it for 20 years, it seems like it's worth trying it for at least a year. And again, the budget committee has approved it.
Layla, I have a different question, although I do want to just say that the FCS model, I thought, was both complex and in some ways I do think that it did not seem to fit neatly some of the specifics in Manzanita. I think that the Warrenton model in its simplicity is more easily, for me at least, to see it as a better fit. So I'm glad we're done with FCS. I think Warrenton is an improvement. I certainly think some proxy-based formula is state of the art. As far as I can tell, it's what most governments, businesses, nonprofits, foundations, etc., utilize, and so I'm supportive. But I am curious, and I apologize because I'm sure in those 7 public meetings this came up and was explained to me, but I'm going to ask you again. I understand why we don't do the allocation for general fund departments like the police, obviously, but what about the tourism promotion? Why would we not take an allocation from that?
That's a great question. Thank you for asking. So I explored that as part of the budget process last year, and working with legal. So I was the first city manager to use TLT funds to help cover costs for maintaining our visitors facilities. So the guidance from the city attorney was it would be better to capture those costs by assigning personnel costs to that fund. So if you look at last year's budget, there's a portion, it didn't have it before, but we actually have personnel paid out of the TLT fund to pay for things like bathroom maintenance and dog poop stations. And so that's why we did it there, is because with TLT and the limitations on the use of those funds, it felt the direction I felt most comfortable with was what the city attorney suggested that I do. So that was to use the personnel funds and not do an actual transfer. That ambiguity doesn't exist with the building department or the water department.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Layla, I know we've been talking about how the water department needs money to make repairs, and one of the things that we're looking at are possible grants, and there is money out there. And I think Linda had said that a lot of the repairs, I believe, Linda, you mentioned that a lot of the repairs would be coming from grants and outside sources. FEMA grants, I know, require time cards. So if we go with this indirect cost and have to change to requirements for money that we would receive from the FEMA, are you going to be able to make those adjustments?
We have time cards.
You do have time cards.
Yeah, we do. And the public works staff all track their time by fund because they physically go and do that work. Administrative staff don't. And there's no way to do that. I don't. People may say there's a way to do that. There's not a way to do that in an efficient way. So staff, we keep time cards, and we would be, I don't see that being a barrier.
Okay. Is there any other discussion from anyone? So do we want to move this to the agenda at the council meeting to put a vote on it?
Yes.
At the next session? You
Definitely.
say yes? Jenna, Brad, Jerry?
Yes.
Okay. Any other questions? Discussion? Okay. Budget committee discussion.
Thank you.
Budget committee discussion, next item. Linda and Jerry, you were going to talk about this?
Yes.
Process, is that correct?
Yes, I'll take the lead. So Linda and myself and Jim Dopp from the Budget Committee formed the Budget Committee Selection Committee, along with Nina Christ, our finance manager, as a non-voting staff participant in the process. And we met 3 times. We interviewed a total of 8 candidates, one of whom ended up withdrawing during the process. So there were 7 candidates under consideration. All of the candidates certainly had the substantial or significant budgeting experience that our criteria for selection required. By the way, the state law that authorizes local budget committees doesn't specify any particular experience, but our criteria did ask for either public or private sector budgeting experience, and in the case of private sector, we wanted it to be substantial or significant. And by the way, one of the reasons we had that criteria is because, as the council knows, the budget committee is made up of 5 counselors and 5 members of the public. And I think I can speak for all 5 counselors that our own budget experience, at least as a collective, is not substantial or significant. And so we really look to the public members, the non-elected members of the committee, to provide that budgetary experience to a large extent, and we're blessed with that on the current budget committee, and I think we were blessed with that in the pool of applicants. So we held the interviews, and the interviews were critical to our decision making. As I think Linda pointed out, but I think all of us intuitively know, you can learn a lot from applications. You can learn a whole lot more, I think, from interviews. That's always been my experience, both as a job seeker and as a hiring individual. So in any event, we had 8 good interviews, one of whom ended up withdrawing. But in the end, we settled on 3 candidates that we're going to talk about both now and in the evening meeting. First, I want to just touch on one subject that came up as we were going through the process. We shouldn't be looking at 3 people at one time. There's supposed to be a staggering of terms so that every year, roughly a third of the public members are up. So you have 5 public members. Obviously, you can't divide that evenly by 3, but we should have 2 openings every year and then 1 opening in the 3rd year. So I'm not sure, honestly, how it came to be that we had 3 all at once. But to correct that, we are proposing that 2 of these terms be for 3 years and 1 of these terms be for 2 years. Now, we did have 2 members of the Budget Committee, Chip Greening and Catherine Stock, apply for reappointment. And I think everybody can acknowledge that that's both a blessing and a curse for the people making the choice, because obviously we know these members. We're familiar with them. We've worked with them. And so they've had an opportunity to display to us their abilities and skills and talents. But obviously they also have the ability to demonstrate to us any shortcomings or any reasons why we would not choose to put them back on the committee. They're both 2 excellent candidates. They presented extremely well in their interviews. All 3 of us, Linda, myself, and Jim, as fellow committee members, strongly recommend that Chip and Catherine be reappointed. So that left a 3rd vacancy to be filled. And our recommendation is Kit Keating, who is a certified public accountant, retired from a career in the insurance business, where she spent the last 19 years of her career as an assistant vice president and controller of a insurance company based in Kansas City, Missouri. Now, because we have this unique process where the full council votes on the budget committee, begs the question, do we vote on the committee as a slate, or do we vote on the committee one at a time? And I guess that's a discussion for council right now. We don't have to decide, but tonight we can either bring each candidate up for council vote one at a time, or we can bring them up as a slate. So I would turn to my fellow councilors for input.
Well, I was curious how the process was going to play out, and I mean, basically, it's kind of a short list. Did you rank the candidates at all in case one of these people falls out, or?
We didn't do a formal ranking because the council agreed at our last meeting to follow our selection process up to a certain point. I'm not sure what the numbering is in the.
I think it's E.
Right. And so I think it's F where the ranking of a short list comes into play, and we only went to E. Well, what I would say, because we did look at the process in the rules, and not surprisingly, as we tried to make adjustments on the fly at the last meeting. I think council made at least one error that should be corrected, and it comes into play right here because we talk in the rules about interviewing all qualified applicants, which we did because all applicants were qualified, and therefore we interviewed all of the applicants. We then, in the very next section, talk about a short list of additional ranked qualified candidates. So the term qualified really can't mean two different things in two different places, so close together, I don't think, in a rule. So I think we should clean that up. We don't have to clean it up to get through the budget process, but the reason I bring it up here is because all 7 candidates, well, 8 actually, but all 7 candidates who were under final consideration were qualified applicants. Does that mean that all 7 candidates were qualified candidates, or do you want us to rank 4 through 7? I would say that the need to do that depends on whether or not there is sufficient council support for the 3 people that we are proposing. If the 3 people we're proposing are supported by a majority of council, then I don't think there's a need to rank the other 4, but I do think we need to clarify this ambiguity about saying that in one section we're talking about qualified applicants, and in the very next section we're talking about qualified candidates, and we really mean a very different thing. So I'm glad you brought that up because I do think we need to fix that before we fully utilize the process again.
I had a couple of questions. Was Nina part of were Nina and Jim part of the interview process as well?
Well, Jim certainly was. Nina had a illness that prevented her from participating in the interviews, but she was able to watch the taped interviews. And she participated in the final discussions, but she did not cast a vote.
Okay. And
I should also say, I'm sorry, I neglected to say that the committee was unanimous in its recommendations of Chip, Catherine, and Kit.
Should we see if we have council?
Yeah, I was going to chime in, and maybe before we move on with other questions that based on what I've seen, I've read everyone's application. I trust the selection committee. I trust the process. I will be approving your slate. I think we had a great group of applicants, and thank you for taking the time and vetting and working through it.
Jim.
well, it's a really long process, and going through all of those interviews, I'm really thrilled to see that become part of the process because I think it is key as we move forward. I feel a little bit in that I don't have a good handle on all of the candidates. I went through all of the applications. I didn't realize that the interviews were on tape. Is that correct? And that we could have viewed those. Is that accurate? Is that no? Does anybody?
I think Nina listened to the audio, did she? Or
Yeah, and I think they're gone now. I don't think she saved them.
Okay. Okay, so I would approve the nominations based on practicalities and pragmatism. In principle, I would like to assure that going forward, when we are looking at committee members, that there's a little more available interaction between between council members and the and the candidates. I know in Cannon Beach, for example, they had a committee appointment at their meeting last night, and they narrowed it down to 3 people and then asked those 3 people to come to the council session and just answer a couple of questions and let people kind of get to know them a little bit before casting a vote. But would like to thank you for your time, and it was an involved process, and this one on the budget committee is a little bit different than the planning commission. So it's the first time we're going here.
Hey, come on.
I'll go ahead and trust the process as well. I do have a question for you, Jerry and Linda.
Sure.
You know, we decided in our committee selection process that we were going to interview everybody, and I think there was some back and forth as to whether that was necessary. You said that the interviews were really important as far as determining your candidates. Just to get some feedback about the process itself, do you think that's a smart move moving forward, or is that something that we need to address again?
Well, I just personally, I thought it was very informative. I think interviews, you learn a lot about people during an interview process, and there were 8, so there were a lot to interview, but I thought it was well worth the time that we spent. It helped us make a better decision in the end, and I would recommend continuing to do that. I thought it was definitely worthwhile.
Yeah, and what I would say is, 8 is a manageable number. I was not involved in scheduling the interviews. I'm sure that was a pain in the neck. First, Nina had to schedule Linda, Jerry, and Jim to make sure we could all be available on the same day, and then she had to schedule 8 applicants. So there could be a point at which it could become pretty clunky, pretty cumbersome. I was reflecting back on when Mike Scott and I looked at a batch of applications for the short-term rental committee, and it was pretty easy to rule out some folks based on their application. So not everybody puts in an application that makes you want to interview them. In the case of these 8, I would agree that they were 8 interesting and qualified candidates, applicants, I should say. And so we interviewed them all. And like I said, as we hoped for, because you do hope that when you're a selection committee, you hope that there's a natural separation. When you get into your interviews, you really are hoping you don't end the interviews and say to yourself, oh my God, it's 8 equal candidates. What are we going to do? We had the separation we were looking for, and so that was good. So in hindsight, I would agree it's a good idea to interview a lot of people, but I do think that not all applicants are equal, and then not all interviewees are equal. But I'm glad we did it. I think we learned a lot. So I wouldn't do it a different way just yet, but I'd stay on top of that. I mean, we did have, budget committee is different than a planning commission, but there was a little bit of a drop off. We had, I forget the number, but we had a higher number of folks for the planning commission, drop down a little bit for the budget committee. It kind of really depends on how many folks come in the door and how many do you really need to interview in order to get to a quality short final list. But I for now, at least, I think that part of the process, I wasn't a fan of it originally, but I lived through this one. I thought it was a good process. It was, for those who will be involved in future processes, it's not easy or fun. It's a lot of work, and it makes you do some serious, hard talking and decision making. But I think it's a worthwhile process.
I just add to that. The purpose of these committees is to involve a broader segment of the community. And I feel pretty strongly if somebody, if a community member is interested enough to step up and completely fill out their application, they deserve an interview. And, if we get 50 people that may be appointed, which we have to make a decision, but these were good candidates. They were good people. I just believe that we need to encourage the commitment of the community to get involved. And this is one of the ways you get involved. And I learned a lot about the people that were in that process, and will certainly be looking to them to get them involved in other situations, maybe not budget, but others. So I'm a pretty strong proponent of interviewing the people that step up.
Well, I went through all of the applications, and certainly want to thank so many people for taking the time to put themselves out there and to step up. And there was a very impressive number of skills and expertise and experience that you had to choose from. It looked like it was a difficult task before you, but certainly thanks to everyone who applied. And it sounds like when we get through the next meeting, then we'll have congratulations in order.
Before we leave the budget committee topic, I don't make any, well, I think March is a really bad time to be making appointments right in the middle of a budget process. I would like to add to an agenda item in the future, proposing that maybe the appointments be made in the fall or the new year, but I just feel like March in the middle of the season is not the right time.
How would you change that, Jenna?
Oh, well, it won't be for now, but just moving forward, like Jerry said, we shouldn't be filling 3 spots
Right.
every time. It should be 2, 2, and 1. And that maybe when the next round comes, that instead of starting the process in February, March, that we start the process in September, October.
Do we delay starting this term in order to make that happen?
Oh no, I don't. This term, like we're good here. I think for another workshop or another agenda, we can fiddle through the details, but I don't think March is the right time to be making these appointments.
Okay. When does this term start for these folks?
March.
March?
But you can make the appointments earlier and just have them be effective come March. We're here because of the process.
Okay.
So I would concur with Jen.
Yeah, I would think so too. Is there any other discussion before we adjourn?
Oh, Layla, you may be covering this in your manager's report tonight, but we got the LUBA decision, and we obviously need to talk about it. And I assume we need to talk with our attorney behind closed doors beforehand. And so I'm just anxious to get that discussion out there, because there's a lot of interest in the community, obviously, and I think we've got a big lift on our plate. So what do you know about that?
I'm meeting with the city attorney tomorrow. So
All right.
just got the decision last week, just back in the office. So she and I are meeting tomorrow. I have a meeting with my planning team on Friday, and then I should be able to set up an executive session with council to talk about next steps once I better understand what those are.
Right. So just assure us of one thing if you can, and maybe you can't, but so the matter's been remanded at least on some issues, limited issues. Is there a timetable for us by which we have to convene a remand hearing?
So in my review of the decision, I didn't see that, and that's one of the things I want to clarify with the city attorney.
All right.
So we'll be clarifying next steps, timeline,
Good.
And then scheduling out the hearing.
Thank you.
And
Yeah.
Layla, you and I talked about this yesterday in our meeting, but are you going to be able to bring that up again in your report at the city council meeting after this one, so people who are not attending this session can get updated as well?
I'd be more than happy to. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
That would be great.
No problem.
Any other final discussion points? Okay, so we're ready to adjourn the meeting at 4:54. I'd like to thank you all for your time and for all of those folks who joined us as well. And we will be back here at 6 o'clock for the regular session. Okay.
Yeah.
Meeting is adjourned. Thank you.